Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to WunderGraph AMA launch week. Today is the final day of launch week, and we have a very special guest. I'm super excited to know, Benjie Gillam. Benjie, how are you doing today?
Hey, doing pretty good, thanks.
Awesome. Thank you so much for coming on the show. For those of you that don't know, Benjie is a self-described community-funded open source maintainer. Benjie spends much of his time on OSS and is enabled by appreciative and forward-thinking individuals and organizations who sponsor his continuous efforts. He's been working with 5 years attending his GraphQL Working Group. He's become a key member both in terms of his own contributions as well as helping others advance their own submissions. As a member of GraphQL TSC, Benjie is proud to help guide GraphQL into the future and the core maintainer of GraphQL. Benjie, how was that introduction? Did I hit everything or am I missing something?
Yeah, I think that's pretty much it.
Perfect. Well, once again, thank you again so much. So, Benjie, the way we usually start these things off are with the background. And based on your LinkedIn, very interesting. So you started right into as being a CTO for iTogether. Is this something that you co-founded or walk us through that?
Well, actually, things started before that. When I was in my final year of uni, my cousin got in touch with me and he was like, "Hey, I've got this idea for a business, but I need to learn how to program for the web. Can you teach me?" And I thought, "Yeah, I'll give you a go." We worked together for a few weeks, and he was like, "Do you know what? Do you want to just do it with me?" And I was like, "All right." In the end, that didn't turn into anything, but we set up a small dev agency, and we called Brain Bakery, and then we built a bunch of stuff for a bunch of pretty recognizable companies, at least in the UK. And as part of that, we really found that what we wanted to do was like startup-y stuff. So we did the iTogether that you mentioned, which was sort of Facebook related. It was to do with blogging, which of course was a big thing back then, the blogosphere and all that. We did mobile apps, mostly via the iOS platform. In fact, we went through Y Combinator with our app FitFu back in 2010, I think. I've done a whole bunch of other stuff over the years. And then about, I guess, 6 years ago now, I effectively became the maintainer of this project post-GraphQL, which is now post-GraphQL.
Amazing. What a way to get started. And so also, so you did FitFu and then Brain Bakery. Was that a consultancy group that you started? You were there for a decent amount of time.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I was one of the two founders with my cousin of that. It was a development agency. We made mobile apps, we made websites. We used to do right early on. We used to do a lot of WordPress stuff. We then did a lot of more bespoke stuff. Yeah, all sorts of interesting things for interesting people. It was good fun.
Love that. And then, so how did you get involved with GraphQL? Were you just contributing, and then how did you become the lead maintainer? Did you co-found it? What's the story behind that?
Well, as I finished one of my previous businesses, I thought I'll figure out what's next. And I'd wanted to play with GraphQL for a while. I was really excited about the technology. I'd seen, of course, what Facebook had done with React in the past. And so, I mean, honestly, you look at GraphQL, you use graphical the first time, and you're just like, wow, this is everything I've ever wanted an API to be. And at that point, I've been writing APIs and consuming APIs for a decade and a half, maybe 2 decades, I don't know. Time, who knows? But anyway, yeah, so I was like, this is amazing. I want to play with this. And I finally got this opportunity. So I was like, whilst I'm experimenting with whatever my next business idea is being and trying out different things, I'll build them on this GraphQL basis. But I'm a startup. I don't have time to write, 8 levels of abstractions. Let's just see what I know how to write a database. What's the quickest way to get started? And a guy called Caleb Meredith had made a project post-GraphQL, which he'd presented at one of the GraphQL conferences back in the day. And basically, it would look at your Postgres database, and it would expose it as a GraphQL API. And those of us who know Postgres well know that Postgres has all this stuff built in that a lot of people don't know about, like row-level security, and like all these powerful functions and triggers and all this other stuff that you can use. So actually you can build a full application just in your database. And I can write out a database schema in minutes. So I type that down. I've then got my app, got my API. And now all I've got to do is build my mobile app. But one of the things that happened was PostgreSQL, fantastic piece of software. It was not highly optimized to do the things that I wanted it to do. I think I was maybe pushing some edges. And I realized that actually the way that it worked, which is, I mean, honestly, a way that a lot of GraphQL APIs work, you know, the data loader style and that kind of thing, was not really well set up. And I'd looked at GraphQL, and to me, you know, like SQL, it's a declarative language, right? It says you send a request through and that describes everything that you need it to do. And yet I was going like, why am I doing like 100 round trips to the database? Like, I mean, sure, my GraphQL query is big, but like I say everything up front, what I need. Why is it doing this? So I thought there's probably a better way of doing this. And that's when I went about building what became GraphQL Engine, which was the foundation of PostgreSQL version 4. It gave this look-ahead system that enabled us to figure out what was coming, build a big SQL query to get all that data, and then send that back out through the resolvers so that you can add your own business logic on top if you needed to, and then obviously send that to the client. And that was really great. Yeah.
Love that. Jens, do you have any questions or anything? Any feedback?
Questions? Many, but well, technical questions a lot. One personal question I have, Benjie. Do you remember when we first met?
I am terrible at remembering meeting people because I think for me, like online personas and real life personas are kind of the same thing. So everyone that I like watch videos on YouTube or whatever, and people that I've met in real life, they kind of be the same. But I would guess, was it GraphQL Berlin?
We didn't meet in person.
Ah, that would make sense.
Not yet, but we are meeting you this week.
Not yet, but next week
Conf.
for the first time.
Awesome.
So I think from my memory, and it's fuzzy, but I think around 5 or so years ago, I was also starting to build stuff in the GraphQL ecosystem and open source it. That's when I started to build GraphQL Go tools, which is quite similar to what you do, just in a different way, because you talk about look-aheads and analyzing GraphQL ASTs and turning that into SQL ASTs. And GraphQL Go tools does the same thing, just not for databases, but for like today for federation and REST APIs and other things. So I think it's kind of quite similar what we do. We just do it a bit different and in different stacks, and we probably solve different problems. But I kind of remember that we met 5 years ago, and we were talking a bit about the things we're working on and the approaches. And we for a little while it was a very little while we were considering working together. Somehow that didn't work out, and everybody went their way. And finally, after 5 years, we meet, and I think it's pretty cool.
Yeah, it's pretty cool.
That's awesome. And then this week, we're super excited. I mean, we're looking forward to your talk, and we're just looking forward to meeting with the whole, GraphQL community. And so what I love the most, and I really want to frame the discussion around this, is open source. And you're obviously very big on open source, but a lot of people don't understand that the only way open source can work is sponsorship. And so when I look at the website for GraphFast, could you introduce what GraphFast is? And then I love what you do, which is sponsor for access. Can you walk us through what GraphFast is?
Yeah, absolutely. So, as I talked about with PostgreSQL version 4, we had this look-ahead system that built one single SQL query for the whole thing. But I realized that what I actually wanted is that dream that I had, 5, 6 years ago when I looked at GraphQL and I thought, this is a declarative language. It should be able to do the same kind of things that my database can do. It should be able to move the plan around and figure out what's going to happen. And it's the way that it works currently just doesn't really allow that. So I thought, can I build something that does this kind of thing, this query planning like the database does, but for any arbitrary data source? So what GraphFast does is it effectively gives you a way of writing code that looks very similar to the code that you would normally write in your resolvers. But that code, rather than actually telling you, telling the system, here is exactly how to fetch the data, instead of saying fetch the data, it says, here is how you would go about fetching the data. So it sets up this, this plan, and you get these little nodes in the plan that show what is going to happen. You get this chance to then manipulate those, and you can optimize them. And that can involve like completely restructuring what's going to happen. And then ultimately, you execute that plan, you get the data, and then GraphFast will take care of like figuring out where all those things originally came from and putting it back into the shape that GraphQL would expect, so that you're then sending it back as a completely valid spec compliant GraphQL response. So it enables this kind of like even, I would say that with version 4, we solved like n+1, we solved overfetching, we solved underfetching, but we still weren't doing it as efficiently as we possibly could. And what GraphFast enables is suddenly to do everything with any data source as efficiently as you can, and still be really easy to work with and to write. But I've been working on this since I think February 2020. So it's been a long time of, I mean, honestly, I've rewritten the system 5 times over from scratch, because each time it's led me down the wrong path. I've known what sort of the end goal that I want to get to, but I've not done it the right way, or it's not then worked with, let's say, stream and defer, or it's not worked with subscriptions, or I've missed a key thing that misses out an entire use case or something like that. And I finally got this system, GraphFast, that I'm ready for the world to use pretty much. So in that period of time, I haven't wanted people to come in and start using it, because I'm going to break it next week. I'm going to break it the week after, you know? So it doesn't make sense to just open it to the world, because I'm just going to have all these people saying this thing's broken from this thing you released 6 months ago. And I'll be like, well, yeah, that was 6 months ago. I want to release stable software. And if you look at PostGraphQL version 4, for example, I think I released that maybe 2018. And it's still stable now, right? It's still version 4. It's like 4.14 now, something like that. It's had, I don't know, 60 releases over the time, but it's stable. And it hasn't really had any major breaking changes over that entire period. And that's what I want the experience to be for people. So whilst I'm still iterating heavily and breaking APIs deliberately whilst I'm discovering what needs to happen, I didn't want to open it up to the world. But I did need support, because, you know, I can't just spend all my time building something. So yeah, initially, I did it in my own time. And then as I needed support, I started reaching out to my sponsors and saying, hey, I'm working on this project. Can you, sponsor me a bit more, maybe help me to bring this thing to fruition? And then from early this year, we started giving people access to the early versions of it, saying, this isn't the finished version, but it works and you can use it. And the response has been really good. Like, obviously, there's been edge cases that have been caught where some things weren't as good as they could have been. But generally, the feedback has been fantastic. All those problems have been fixed. And now we're getting to the point where we're looking to potentially open it to a wider audience. But that sponsorship barrier has really helped to be able to help me get to this finish line or towards it.
Okay, that makes sense. And Jens, I already know you probably have a bunch of technical questions, so I will let you take it away. Go ahead.
Few technical, but also some questions around open source. But let me start with one thing. So I wrote an article in 1 sec, because as you started speaking about GraphQL, it was like 1 second. So it was 2022, like 8 March. And I wrote an article about thunk-based resolvers. Would you say that, or first of all, I'm not sure if that's a general term and everybody understands what a thunk-based resolver is, but would you say that GraphQL is built around the idea of thunk-based resolvers?
I would have to familiarize myself, but I suspect not. Maybe in its most basic form. But really a lot of what comes down to what GraphQL can do is like restructuring what the execution is going to be. So I think with a thunk-based approach, from my very quick extrapolation, it sounds like it gives you the ability to effectively discover the function calls before actually executing, which is great to discover that. GraphQL then takes care of like a whole bunch more on top of that, adds more power and flexibility.
Okay, that makes sense, because like I really like what you do, because for a very long time I was thinking about, when we build GraphQL servers, what we kind of do is we have, let's say we have a schema, which you could also say, okay, that's just a tree. And then at some nodes, you put a resolver in this tree. So that means if you put input into this function that somewhere sits in the tree, and you execute this function, you get back data. That is the simplest version of a GraphQL server. And the problem obviously here is, the moment you call this function, you cannot optimize it anymore, because you might have had metadata that would tell you that you should definitely not call a resolver that is deeply nested in this tree, because that would be crazy inefficient. There's another resolver that does batching or something. It's much more efficient. But how would you be able to know this if you just executed that function? So, and the idea, and I guess I really just scratched the surface, but the idea I had with thunk-based resolvers is that you don't directly write resolvers. You write functions that tell the engine how it might get data if it wants to, but it can also do it differently. Like, it's more like, I don't know, but I guess it's very similar to GraphQL. I just never did a lot with that idea.
That's certainly one of the options with GraphQL. Yeah, you can choose, or the planning engine can effectively choose to do things in a different way. I mean, one of the basic examples of that is, say you want to get a user and then you want to get like the events related to that user. To get the events related to the user, you don't actually need the user, right? You just need their ID. So you can then go and look it up from another table or something like that. So one of the things that GraphQL lets you do is, when you have your user like plan object, for want of a better word, you can say, if they ask for the ID, rather than giving them a thing that represents getting the ID from the user, give them the thing that represents the ID that came in. And then suddenly these two nodes that were in a chain can now be siblings. But that's like a really simple optimization that you can do with GraphQL, like in like one line of code. There is much more powerful things than you can do than that.
This is interesting because it sounds similar. So a couple of days ago, we were talking to Michael Stipe from Chili Cream, and we were talking about GraphQL Fusion. And there's this directive where you can write an @is on an input. And by doing that, you can tell the GraphQL engine that the input to a field equals the output, or equals an output field. And that tells the query planner, it can give the query planner information that if you actually put the input into a query and you just want the idea, it actually does nothing, because it already knows input is output. And then sounds very similar to that.
Yeah, there is a very small issue with this problem, which, for example, let's say you've got that get user by ID, right? So you've got the number 7 and you say, I want a user by that ID 7. And you know that the ID of that user that you're going to get out is going to be 7, right? Or is it? If the user doesn't exist, it's not going to be. So you do have this issue where this is something that you only want to do when you're absolutely certain. So if you've got, for example, database referential integrity that tells you, when I say there's a user 7, there is definitely a user 7, you can use it. But some of the time it would be like a lie to return an object that says, you know, they've only asked for the user's ID, so I'll just give them the 7 back, but actually that user doesn't exist anymore, or they were deleted or whatever. So there are interesting things that come out of this.
And you know, this is the cool thing. This is when you speak to someone who openly says, I rewrote this a couple of times. And I guess there's a few iterations where, like, in the first iteration, you didn't know that. Second iteration, you didn't know that. And then over time, eventually you kind of brute forced yourself through the whole array of problems.
Yes, it does definitely feel like that for sure.
Great. Okay, that's so cool. Coming back to open source. So for me, and I'm not lying, you're a big inspiration, because over the many years I observe what you do, and it always looked and looks to me like you've actually made a living out of open source. One of very few people who kind of found a way to, you know, like there's you can go for VC money, you can go for hyperscale, you can do all sorts of things, you can have an agency, and you somehow started with GraphQL. And tell us a bit about the insights, because from the outside it looks like you live a good life with open source, and that's truly amazing. And I would love, and maybe others as well, to understand a bit more, how did you actually make it? Because just from a couple of people who give you $10 per month, you cannot live off. So how do you do it?
Yeah, great question. I wonder what the answer to that. No, wanting to spend more time on open source is what has effectively governed everything that I've done. So when I started this out, I didn't know what I was doing. Like, I started working on the PostgreSQL project without any intention of being a maintainer of it, without any intention of like dedicating large amounts of time to it or anything like that. I just had this need. I needed better performance. So I built a thing to do that and said to the maintainer, here's a bunch of codes. You probably don't want to take this code as it is, but like, this demonstrates the concept of what I think we need to do to make this project better. Like, let me know what you think. And like any open source maintainer who receives a pull request that's got like, 10,000, 20,000 lines of code, he's like, I don't have time to review that, which is entirely fair, right? Entirely fair. So this is how I got started maintaining, was basically like, I tell you what, all the stuff you normally do for maintenance, dealing with that person's issue, doing that pull request or whatever, I'll do all of those. I'll do all those things, and you just look at my pull request, right? I'll handle all the rest of it, because I know the code base now, because I've literally rewritten it. So that's how I got started on that point. And at one point, Caleb was like, well, actually, I've got a new job. I'm going to be super busy over here. Why don't you just have the project? And I really hope I didn't bully him out of it, because that definitely wasn't my intent. And he seemed happy enough and kept his copyright on the project for quite a while. And yeah, it was at that point I became the maintainer. And shortly after that, whilst I was fiddling around with my different startup ideas, like, oh, does anyone want to use this? I built a thing like a bit like Zapier / if this then that. But more programmer focused. So like, it was actually built with Blockly. So it was like dragging in blocks for building stuff. If you've seen WunderGraph, it was very much like that, but like 5 years earlier. And no one was giving me money for that, right? There was a few people that would play with it. It was a fun toy for a hack day. But I hadn't managed to find the market for that. However, some people were like, hey, that thing you did in PostgreSQL, I'd love to buy you a beer. I'd love to, pay for you to go out for a dinner with your wife or something like that, And I started having this small amounts of money trickling in from the open source and nothing coming in from my new business ideas. And I'm thinking, I've got to go back to doing, doing an agency again, like Brain Bakery. Like, I've got to pay the bills at some point. And so, yeah, I started an agency to do stuff around my projects and just, general stuff as well, if need be. And I encouraged people to donate to the open source. And my aim over the past 5 years has been increase that stream of income through the donations, because the more donations I get, the more time I spend on the open source, the less time I spend on the client work. I don't want to spend no time on client work, because honestly, if you only work on your own stuff, you don't see how people are using it. actually doing consultancy is a valuable exercise for anyone who runs a project like this. But equally, if you're a consultant, like they like bring you in to look at this thing, and then they're like, oh, you're also good at this, right? Let's have you look at, and you suddenly start finding yourself like refactoring React components, and you're like, that's not really core to the things that I'm building. I want to focus on what I'm building. So being able, as the sponsorship grows, to spend more time on the open source has been absolutely vital. And I'm so grateful that the people that use my projects see the value in investing in them. And they see that, like, oh, because Benjie's got more sponsorship, he's built this other project, or he's added this new feature, or he's increased performance, which has decreased our server bills, or, you know, whatever other ways they have of just saying, funding this person who's building stuff and giving it away for free, actually funding him to keep doing that makes sense. I think another part of it is probably that PostGraphQL, if you use it, is such a core piece of like your business architecture. You can't really afford for the maintainer behind it to just go, right, I'm done. I'm going to go and work for Facebook and earn like, you know, 6 times as much as I'm currently earning. Whatever. Like, they don't want you to do that. So if they send you a bit more money, maybe they'll tempt you to stay, which honestly is quite effective. It's why I keep maintaining things. I wouldn't be able to keep maintaining them. Certainly not all the projects I currently have if I didn't have this sponsorship. I'd have to spend my time building a SaaS or a backend as a service, or getting a job somewhere and hoping that they will pay for me to spend, you know, 20% of my time onto that open source, and then watching as that 20% becomes 15 and then 12 and so on. You know, I want to keep doing the open source, and the purest way to do that, like you mentioned earlier, Stefan, is through sponsorship. There's so many other ways of making money for open source, but the purest one, the one that means that I can spend the most time on open source, is sponsorship.
Are you now 100% on GraphQL or GraphFast, or do you still do agency work?
It's a good question. For about, I guess, the last 8 or 9 months, I have been 100% on open source, but I cannot afford to keep that going. That has been like working my way through the you know, everyone who has an agency has like this this bank that they can use to get you through the dry periods, and I've been working my way through that because I really wanted to get GraphFast and PostGraphQL version 5 finished. But yeah, I'm gonna have to start taking some client work up again soon. And also the sponsors that I asked earlier this year to increase their sponsorship, like just saying I'm building this thing, I need your support. Like, they've given me so much money and it's really appreciated, but like, they can't afford to do that forever. That's like, here is your money to finish this thing. And at some point, I mean, I'm basically there now. They are gonna want to step back down, and that is entirely reasonable, right? I can't expect them to support me like that forever. And so I'm either going to need other sponsors to pick up the slack, or I'm going to need to start doing consultancy again, which honestly would be fine because I'd love to see how people are going to be using GraphFast. You know, it's an exciting new piece of technology.
Yeah. So I really hope you find more sponsors. I always think that, what would be a standard sponsorship? Like, what kind of packages do you offer?
So generally, like the base tier of sponsorship is like, thanks, I appreciate you, but like you can't do much for that. We have like have some lovely stickers. There you go. There's like a PostGraphQL Pride sticker. We've got like a nice new GraphFast one. These are shiny, that you can get. You know, a few little nice thank yous. As you go up through the tiers, you know, you can get your logo on the sponsors page or in the readmes as well. And right up at the high end, which is like $1,500 a month, it's like literally, I will come and join your company Slack, and I will sit there in your company Slack. And if you get stuck on anything GraphQL related, or honestly, anything that I can help you with, you ask a question, and generally I'll get back to you pretty quickly. And that generally helps to unblock companies or developer engineering teams really quickly. Even if it's just them asking me a thing that can be answered from the documentation, they ask me and I can tell them where in the documentation it is and, you know, what things to be careful of or how it applies to what I already know about what they've told me before. So that can be quite a useful relationship as well.
So I really hope for you that eventually this will work out like even better. You know, if I look from my perspective, we are a VC funded startup. Like we're not rich of any sort, and we're extremely small, but still VC funded. If I were using GraphFast or GraphQL, I can afford to pay like $500, $1K per month, and the way I can tell this, like we also do open source. So one way you can actually sell this is if you pay Benjie some money, you will have one of the smartest people on your Slack, and they can help you immediately, and they can give you pointers and anything that can save you so much money with all this knowledge. It's like an LLM for you that's crazy smart on some specific things. Like, so unfortunately, I'm not using GraphFast, but if we did, so I can say we have a couple of tools. For example, we use Learner-Lite and some other things. Learner-Lite for releasing software, and we have a mentality of sponsoring open source projects that we use because we're like, yeah, we know open source. Someone needs to pay the bills, and I always feel like if everybody gives a maintainer like you $10 per month, you would be crazy rich, man. So I don't know. I think we need to do more, and we need to somehow change our mindset. Like if we make something like GraphFast core to our business, can we not pay $100, $200? Like if you look at the money we spend on Datadog and anything else, like definitely Benjie is going to do better stuff with your money than Datadog, you know? So, but enough with that. One other thing I wanted to bring up is you said the word wife. And one thing I observed over the years is suddenly it wasn't just Benjie who did GraphQL stuff, but suddenly I saw there was another person that did some podcasts with you, and there were some other appearances. Are you working together with your wife, or is it your partner, or I don't know?
Yeah, that's right. So my wife Jem, we've been working we founded the company together, so we own it basically half and half, and we've worked together in the past as well. Like we've been, was it 2000? I think we got together. So we've been together for like 20 years. So we get on really well, and we can work together really well, and we have done over the last like 6 years. And as the product has what we've been building has been getting like I guess more momentum. Jem's been getting more and more involved in like the public facing parts. I think originally Jem was a bit, I would say probably a bit shy, and was like, no, I'll just do the things behind the scenes. I'll help out, but like it's your project. But now it's our projects, which is great. So I'm super excited, and I look forward to the time where someone does a conference during the summer holidays when the kids are off school, so that me and Jem can go to the conferences together. We've gone to a couple in the past, like FOSDEM we've been to in Brussels, which was really nice, the big open source conference. But generally, it's me alone, because I'm the one who wrote the tech, most of it.
Is Jem also a developer, or what's her role in your company?
Jem was a QA engineer a few years back, so like writing tests and that kind of things. But Jem generally, we describe as the wearer of all the hats. Jem does like all the things that I don't do, and I mostly do the code, and I write the documentation as well, I suppose. And Gem does literally everything else that makes our business a business. You can come and wave if you want.
Yes, please tell her to come wave.
Hi.
Yes, hello,
Hey,
welcome. That is so cool.
She cannot
in the
hear us, right?
headphones. So,
Okay. We'll just wave then.
Yeah.
So cool. I love it. You're keeping it in the family.
Gem's currently finishing the slides for the conference talk at GraphQL Conf next week, and honestly, they are looking fantastic. If it were me doing them, it would just be like standard like clip art on Google Slides, and it would look terrible. But Gem makes it look fantastic, and yeah, they are. I'm really excited to present them.
That's amazing. That
Awesome.
is awesome. Jens, go ahead. Any more questions?
No, I love what you do. It's a great story. Fun fact: my wife is also working at WunderGraph, in a very similar way. Like she owns finance and everything, but aside from that, he tries to remove as much overhead from my role as she can. Like we're still kind of small, and I'm the CEO, but a lot of the time I still write code and work in the engineering team. And obviously there's a lot of things around my role that are kind of time consuming, and she helps me with all of that. So yeah, it's cool to see a similar
honestly,
situation.
It's so critical. I couldn't do what I'm doing without my sponsors, and I could not do it without Gem. I just wouldn't have the time. There's so much to do, so much other stuff to do that takes away from the code. And the code is where I bring the value. So that's what I try and focus on.
Yeah. One other thing. So I haven't looked into it, but I was always very interested in. Do you know this? There was a website. When is React ready or something, like where you could see like a countdown of the issues, and you could see, okay, can you finally use React or something? So is the one-off directive ready?
That's a great question. So for those who don't know, one-of is a directive to add input polymorphism into GraphQL. So we've already got interfaces and unions for output, but we kind of want something similar for input. And we spent a lot of time building a lot of different solutions. And one-of was my proposal, which effectively was, let's take what we've already got and just like tag it and just say, now it's polymorphic, by just basically having all the other things disappear. And it turned out to actually tick more boxes than any of the other solutions that seemed like they would have been better at first. This better maps to the polymorphism in the output schema and things like that. Actually, input polymorphism turns out simple is what you want. So yeah, the spec edits are, as far as I'm concerned, done. There is now an implementation in GraphQL JS, and that is available, I think, only in version 17, which is currently in, I want to say, alpha. But I'm not 100% up to date on that. So you can try it in GraphQL JS, and of course, it's implemented. I know it's implemented in Hot Chocolate because Michael implements everything, all the different versions of everything. He's amazing. He stays on top of, I don't know how he does it. But yeah, so it's in Hot Chocolate as well. And I think it's in a number of other situations. I know the Guild, for example, have a plugin for Envelop. So if you have a server that supports Envelop, you can use one-of with that. I'm not sure that it's 100% spec compliant. I think it doesn't maybe implement the introspection. But again, I'm not up to date on that. That was a while ago. But yeah, we are literally just waiting, I guess, for feedback from the community. Like, go out there, use it, let us know. Does it fix the problem? Is it the right solution? And if it is, then hopefully we'll ship it through to the next stage. I think it's currently RFC2, so it'll be moving it onto RFC3 and into the spec.
Does it have a discriminator?
So one-of works like an input object. So if you imagine an input object where you've got like cat, dog, fish, right? Where you've got a field cat and the value is a cat, and you've got field dog or cat input, probably dog, dog input, fish, fish input. One-of just says you only specify the one field and everything else goes away. So the discriminator is the field name and no other field names are present. So you can think of it a little bit, I guess, as boxed, but where rather than having a key that says, here's the type and then here's the data, the key itself is the type. Okay,
that makes sense. So we send an object, and depending on what field on that object it's set, and I guess we are only allowed to send one of the fields, right?
One of, indeed.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. Okay, yeah, it sounds reasonable. No, I'm glad we finally have this, because I felt like for a very long time there are use cases, and it's great that it's coming around, but it feels like eternity passed.
Yeah, tell me about it. I think one of the things is that it's going to really help with some of the patterns that you see in GraphQL APIs, where you want to, for example, get a user. You might get a user by their ID, or you might get a user by their email, or you might get them by their username or something like that. And at the moment, for type safety reasons, those tend to be 3 different fields, because having all 3 of those optional doesn't make sense, and you won't specify all 3 of them. So it's kind of hard to do in a type safe way unless you have 3 separate fields in a GraphQL schema. But with one-of, you'd be able to say user by, and then one of either ID, username, email, or whatever you want to add in future. And of course, those things can be scalars, or they can be other composite types. So it might be like by ID, by email, or by the organization ID and their registration number, let's say, something like that. So very flexible.
So as I'm building the engine for an open source federated router, I can see a lot of fun coming my way, because it means if we resolve nested entities, and those can have one-off directives, it can be turned very interesting to figure out, like, let's say you have a nested entity and you need a field, and some other field has a requires directive, and that requires depends on a field with the one-off directives, and now you actually need to figure out, okay, based on the one-off input, what are possible inputs that I currently actually have, so I can make that entity query. So I can, yeah, luckily at some point we split the engine department into 2 teams. So we have team query planner, which is Sergey, and we have team execution, which is me. We're just joking around that we have the 2 teams. We always keep blaming the other team for doing something wrong or something. But yeah, I think the planner team will have some fun in the future with the one-off directive.
Yeah, polymorphism is one of those things that just suddenly makes everything way more complicated. It's really important for like being expressive, and also, like I say, for being sort of concise in what you want your schema to say. But yeah, suddenly where you have this like path that just goes linearly, now you've got this branching, and that then can branch again, and that can branch again, and you get this combinatorics problem, and suddenly things get quite challenging. But again, I mean, people need it, so good luck to your 2 teams.
Yeah, but to be honest, like, I like building a company. I like the challenge around that. Like, it's a lot of fun, but from time to time, and it might not be everybody's thing, but I really enjoy building up an AST in my head and thinking about how can I solve this and that problem, and thinking about like, you know, for me, and then I'm just a nerd here, but for me, building a query execution planner and engine was the most fun part of my life. Like, aside from other things, kids and so on and so forth. But point is, I just really enjoy thinking about, okay, I have an input query, I have my metadata for how I might resolve that from subgraphs. So how can I traverse through these ASTs and figure out how to get this? This is so enjoyable for me, like thinking in these data structures and trying to figure out, okay, what kind of metadata do we need to create these the paths to this data? And for me, that's just enjoyable work. And I think as you're working with Graphast and GraphQL, your head is probably similarly wired, and you also love these kind of puzzles, right?
Yeah, that's why I want to spend time doing what I love, right? Writing the open source software. I want everyone to be able to enjoy it. But like, again, if people want me to keep making it, it's sponsorship that I rely on. But yeah, it's such fun. And I feel so privileged to be able to do this, to be able to be like I guess the champion of my own destiny, to choose, this is the problem I want to solve, and I want to solve it, in this way, or even to explore and find out what that solution even is. I spent a lot of time at the beginning of this project looking at GraphQL queries and then thinking, right, ignore whatever's in the middle. What should the end result be? Not what should the data be that I send to the user? That's obvious. What should the result be that I actually send to my data stores? Like, what's the SQL queries that I'm going to build? What's the REST APIs that I'm going to call? If I was solving this one thing myself as a human, and this was the only thing I ever had to solve, and I didn't have to do resolvers or anything like that, I just literally had to respond with the data in this structure. What's the most efficient way that I could write that code? Great. How do I make a system do that automatically depending on this variable input? And yeah, it's such an interesting challenge. It has really pushed me to the limits of my capabilities, I think. But it's been fun.
It leads me to a question. Have you considered using an LLM? Because so you have a GraphQL schema, you have a database schema. Is it possible with some guidance or something, or have you even considered or thought about it? Is it possible to train an AI model or something to write resolvers, or not resolvers, but maybe can you take a query and ask the LLM to generate SQL, or is that not working? Or do you have any experience in this field?
I have a healthy distrust of LLMs. I love them. They're great. Like, I talk to ChatGPT all the time, and it's fantastic for things like asking, what's a quintessentially British way of saying this particular phrase, so that I can play up my Britishness, for example. But I do not trust their answers, and no one really should. I certainly would not trust them with my business logic. Trusting them to generate a GraphQL query, yeah, fine. Trusting them to write code that's going to run on the server where all of my secrets are stored, no. That does not sound like a good time. I've had some interesting requests, for example, because I help out in the GraphQL community. There are people who say like, oh, I don't understand this thing. So I've asked ChatGPT this, and it's given me this answer. And then I was like, whoa, what does that mean? And then I've asked it this to expand on that. And I've asked, and so what is the result? And I'm like, right, well, right in ChatGPT's first answer, it's wrong. And then it's expanded on being wrong multiple times. I'm not going to go through and tell you all of the ways ChatGPT was wrong about this. It gives you answer-shaped results rather than actually answers. Nonetheless, it is fun. And I think if you've got a programmer there supervising it, like things like Copilot, for example, fantastic way to kick out some code that is about the right shape, and then you can read over it and say, oh, that's exactly what I wanted. Or why has it got a plus there? That shouldn't be there. That's going to give me an off by one error or whatever, and fix the relevant part.
Yeah, I think this was also more kind of my idea, that you don't ask LLM to actually fetch or write the SQL, but you can ask to assist in writing. So maybe maybe think of it like in the future, GraphFast could have a plugin system or something, and you can tell GraphFast what kind of resolvers you need or what kind of data you have, and it can create migrations, a database schema, and it can also generate resolvers. These resolvers might be wrong, but they could also be very close to correct. But you can review everything, and you can use AI to have an assistant in writing your GraphQL server faster.
And we have a question from the audience, so either one of you guys can answer this. So your opinion of an LLM in programming is to provide a skeleton or blueprint that requires human implementation and refinement. So Benjie, if you want to go ahead and answer that.
That is effectively what I've hit the nail on the head there. Well done.
Well done,
I certainly
David.
would not run code from an LLM on the server unless it was maybe in a sandbox. If you can put enough constraints around how it works, then maybe. But yeah, so long as you're supervising it and you're checking over everything, and I mean actually like reading all of the code, not just going, oh yeah, this looks generally fine, then yeah, I think fantastic tool, incredibly good at like accelerating your development. And as it can learn, the APIs of the libraries that you work with, it just gets better and better. And you end up thinking, oh, I need it to do something like this. And you write like 5 words and suddenly you've got an entire method that does almost exactly what you had in your head, but it's much faster coming out of the LLM than it is coming out of your fingers desperately tapping away at Vim.
By the way, I'm trying to figure out how can we make open source better? How can we fund creating open source? And how can this be beneficial to the people funding it? One thing that came to my mind, and I would love to get your input on this, is what if all vendors who are involved in and who want to, but let's say all vendors who are involved in GraphQL things can contribute to a fund, because there's a lot of venture capital backed companies in the GraphQL ecosystem, like Apollo, Hasura, WunderGraph, Inigo, Escape Tech. Like the list is very long. Many big companies with smaller or big amounts of funding, Neo4j, many others. What if all of these companies could put some money into a fund and fund open source with it? Because if we're a vendor in the GraphQL ecosystem and the GraphQL ecosystem has better tooling that attracts people to use GraphQL, that makes the ecosystem stronger, bigger, attracts more people. And if people use GraphQL or GraphFast, they use GraphQL. So eventually they might use WunderGraph. And if all vendors together create a fund to fund projects like yours, I don't know, it might help, and it could help the ecosystem in general. What's your thought?
It's an interesting one. So there's systems like that already that exist, like Tidelift, for example, that exists to help maintain, I guess, JavaScript packages. I'm not sure what their remit is actually. But one of the big problems with it is like deciding how much money goes to each project. And sometimes it's developed by like some kind of algorithm that someone's put together. Like, oh, it depends on how often it's updated and how many lines of code it has, and also how many stars it has and how many downloads a week it has. And I don't think that that's generally a very good indicator of the value of a project. I think it's very hard to figure out what a specific algorithm is that you can punch into a computer that decides that. PostGraphQL doesn't have like a ridiculously large number of downloads, but to the people that use it, it saves them, ridiculously large amounts of time on their engineering and things like that. So it's hugely valuable to them. And yet a system, as you described, may not end up sending money my way, which is, fine. There is definitely things that benefit everyone. I mean, like look at the guild with things like GraphQL Code Generator and GraphQL ESLint, for example, incredibly useful tools that are used like really widely across the ecosystem. Funding those things better would be brilliant. But yeah, I'm not sure that it will always capture. Another thing that was interesting in what you asked is a thing that I pick up on quite a lot, which is open source companies tend to be the companies that fund other open source companies. What we really need is people that aren't open source companies sending money into the ecosystem. Like, it's all great us all handing money around each other inside the open source companies, but let's actually have some come from outside, which is like, 99% of companies that aren't open source that actually, can bring in so much more impact. And, I think what you're doing as WunderGraph, putting like your money out there to the projects that you use and sponsoring those is fantastic. And I think every company should do that. But at the moment, it does seem to be the ones that are aware of the problem are the ones that do it. And just so many are either aware and they don't care, or they just use the game theory approach of like, well, so long as someone else is giving him some money, I can take the benefits without having any cost. Isn't this fantastic? Capitalism.
So give us the pitch. As someone who is not involved with, so I'm a budget holder in a larger company. I was not involved in open source. Our company doesn't do open source. Why should our company fund open source? Why should we do it?
Well, if you're using open source, then funding open source, I mean, open source itself is used because it's a massive money-saving thing, right? It saves your developers from having to keep reinventing the wheel or having to pay, hundreds of thousands of dollars to Oracle every however often they bill. Open source is fantastic, but it doesn't just happen because, hobbyists like to make things and it's probably fine. It's the whole like guy in Nebraska from the XKCD, right? There is projects that are like that, but really, if you want to have this software be a foundation of your company, let's say Amazon, for example, use this massive sales thing, and they probably build a lot of that based on open source. And in fact, they almost certainly do. If something in that were to have a massive issue and the person who made it can't fix it and their engineers don't understand it, or it would take them, maybe a week to understand how the different bits fit together, they are now vulnerable to a ridiculously like billions of dollars per day or whatever from this small problem. So funding the open source is effectively like almost like an insurance policy. It's like, I don't want this stuff that I rely on to go away because that guy in Nebraska suddenly had a job offer from Facebook and now he doesn't have time anymore. He's going to go and do that. He didn't like his $50 a month he was getting from his sponsors. He wants the 300,000 a year that Facebook's going to give him. So I think it's something like think about all the money it saved you and maybe reinvest some of that. Not necessarily all of it. I've got a pinned tweet on my Twitter or X or whatever he's calling it this week. And it says, I think that companies should take about 5% of their engineering budget and invest that into open source. It seems reasonable. Think of these open source developers as if they were 5% of your engineering team. They're actually way more than 5% of your engineering team, and you're not paying them anything right now. Let's, give them a little bit.
I love that. Absolutely love that. Jens?
Yeah.
I saw you unmute your mic. Go ahead.
Yeah. Just wanted to add, 100% agree. I just see the issue that, what you describe, not paying an OSS developer, although you use the project, it doesn't immediately hurt. Like there's, it's like a mousetrap, but it's actually not. Like if it were a mousetrap and it actually hurt you, the problem is it's like the I don't want to be political, but the problem with the environmental things and temperature going up, the effect and cause is so far away from each other. Like you like you put the hand on the oven, and 7 years later it gets hot. You would just leave the hand there, right? And even though your hand will be burned eventually, but you just don't get it. And this is also, I guess, a problem with open source. Like you're like, well, someone will somehow maintain this, and then suddenly there's nobody left to maintain this, and people cry out, but it's just too late.
I think you're absolutely right. Right, that's absolutely a thing, and it's partly the short-sightedness of capitalism. Like we're always focused on next quarter's results or whatever. But the other thing I think is just the architecture of large organizations. I think developers themselves who use the open source software, I think a lot of them like absolutely want to support the people making it. In fact, I have sponsors from large companies where this small person is like, I can't get my company to sponsor you, but like, here's $8 a month. And it's like, well, thank you. I really appreciate your support. But if your company could give me, you know, $100 a month, that would be even better. And it comes down to, it's very hard to get it through accounting, right? The engineers might want to get it. Often it's, I can spend this money, but can I get it somewhere else for cheaper? And the answer is yes, you can get it cheaper. You just, I mean, we have it anyway. It's here. It was free. Well, then what am I paying for? Well, I mean, for it to continue to exist, but it exists, right? You're using it. Well, I mean, and explaining the concepts of that to like accounting and saying, well, actually, you know, it's really important. This is a fundamental piece of our business. And if this falls over, it's going to be a really big problem. And also, if the person making this gives us like a, you know, 10% performance improvement, that's going to drop our Amazon bills by 5% a month. That's going to save us a bunch of money. Explaining the like hopes and the dreams around that to accounting is quite challenging. And I think a lot of people just give up pretty quickly.
Yeah,
No, well said.
Great. I just wanted to say, it might sound unethical, but you can get a full-time consultant by sponsoring an open source maintainer and outsourcing some of your problems. You would not believe how much open source maintainers will actually help you if you just sponsor them with a little amount. And if enough people would do that, like, I don't know, like, yeah, I'm pitching to the choir, obviously, but I say this for the wider audience, because I just think more people need to support open source. But maybe one idea that I can have from what you said is, maybe we should give all our engineers a very small budget, and they can spend this on open source projects that they believe it will help them with their work. Because they, like you said, they know what they actually use, they know the dependencies. So if you give every developer like 1% of their salary or something to spend on open source projects, and GitHub or some other service could make it super simple to spend this, and accounting could make it simple to give them this money, maybe that would be a solution. I don't know, need to think about it.
Absolutely. I think that is a compelling way to do things. And I think it needs a whole bunch of these approaches. So the approach that you mentioned earlier, where you all pay into a fund and that effectively pays out, that is kind of like the commons. If you think of the issue, the XKCD issue, the guy in Nebraska, right? He's like 7 layers deep in your open source stack. Your engineers probably don't even know that that project exists. Right? It's used as a dependency of a dependency of a dependency of a dependency.
Exactly.
But that isn't to say that the person at the top of that stack doesn't also need support. I'm quite lucky in that I write PostGraphQL, which is like a thing you use directly. I write GraphQL Worker, which you use directly, and GraphQL Migrate, and a bunch of other things. And you are hands-on with these things. So people who use them know to support those projects. And I see it as a bit of my responsibility to then hand some of that money on to the next layer. But the problem is, like, it's so hard to make a living doing open source that I don't have enough money for me to be able to give on as much as I want to that next layer. And we really need, as I said before, we need it coming in from the top, from all the people that are actually consuming this. If this comes in more, then I can give more, and then the next layer can give more, and it will, you know, flow down the the tower of champagne glasses, as it were. Yeah, there's
I love that. And well said. I love to talk about open source. I love open source, but guys, we are at time, so we're going to give it maybe a minute and a half for any questions in the audience. But Benjie, it was an absolute blast. If you want to talk about what you're going to be talking about at GraphQL Conf while we wait for some questions, go ahead, because we're super excited for your talk. And you have to make sure you stop by our booth because we're going to have Federetzels. And so I'll let you think about that, what that is over the weekend. And then when you come to our booth, you'll see some Federetzels. But go ahead. What are you going to be talking about at GraphQL Conf?
I saw the Federetzels on one of your previous videos, and I was like, I wonder what they're talking about. I will be sure to do that. Yes, so in my talk, I will be talking about GraphFast, this new query planning system that I've built. It currently is written in TypeScript, but the plan is to open source it as a specification, effectively. Build it again in another language, most likely, and say, here is a query planning system that we can use for GraphQL that is easy to use. And that, I think, is one of the critical things about it. As I say, post-GraphQL version 4, I built this look-ahead system, but it's really, really, really cumbersome to work with look-ahead in general. It's a really complex pattern, and it makes people think about things way too hard. And what GraphFast tries to do is make it so that it's expressive. It's a bit like rendering React components. That's the kind of feel I'm going for. And yet, at the end of it, you get this ridiculously efficient execution. So I think it would be great if everyone who uses a GraphQL schema uses a pattern like GraphFast, or ideally GraphFast, to power their schema. And because of that, and as a passion project, it is MIT, it's out to the world. I've not patented it. I've not done any of that stuff. Like, go and use it. Like, help me build it, help me turn it into a specification, and then implement it in Go, implement it in Rust, implement it in any language you want. And I'm really excited for it.
Love that. And we can't wait for the talk. So once again, stop by our booth for some Federetzels. Benjie, it was an absolute blast to have you on the podcast. So thank you so much. And we really look forward to seeing you at GraphQL Conf. Thank you, everyone, for who tuned in. This was Benjie from GraphQL.
Thank you for having me. Bye.
Ciao.